good evening, and thank you for joining us. Today is the third annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. The event was being observed across the country and in the city of Thunder Bay to learn from the impact of the residential school system and to remember the children that were lost. This morning began with an Orange Shirt Day gathering at Hillcrest Park. Mike Lang was there.
It was a morning of truth through sharing.
215 kids missing, our missing relatives, our missing brothers, sisters.
And reconciliation through learning.
We weren't allowed to share our true history. We weren't allowed to practice our culture.
Around 100 gathered at Hillcrest Park as a new sitting area was opened to provide the community with a place to commemorate and honor the survivors of the residential school system and to acknowledge the thousands of children who never made it home.
It's very traumatic for our families still today. We're wounded today. We're trying to rebuild, trying to get well from that trauma.
But the trauma over those that were lost created resiliency among those who survived.
They didn't realize that the Anishinaabe people were actually seeds. So when those seeds were buried, eventually we sprouted and became those wildflowers, and we became being very resilient.
The gathering was attended by local community leaders, councillors, and politicians, including Indigenous Services Minister and MP Patty Haidu.
This is, I think, the work of dismantling that heavy colonial system that basically tore away those rights and then established a pattern of control over First Nations lives.
The final and most important step of truth and reconciliation: action.
It is about supporting the leadership of Indigenous peoples to reclaim their own identities, their culture, their language, and their law.
It's very fresh yet. We still got a lot of work to do together, and we're willing to work with the dominant group together to come to terms to understand what really happened.
The morning was capped off by a raising of the survivors' flag. It sails at half-mast as an expression of remembrance and honor for those impacted by residential schools in Canada. Mike Lang, TBT News.
Continuing on with our coverage of Truth and Reconciliation Day events, members of Anishinaabe Aski Nation and residents marched in honor of the children who survived the residential school system, those who never made it home, and those who are still missing. A sea of orange shirts could be seen on the walk from the NAN office on Syndicate Avenue down Arthur Street. Over 100 people participated in the walk, which ended at Vickers Park for speeches, a barbecue, and activities. Attendees heard stories from residential school survivors, as well as words from Deputy Grand Chief Annabette Ashton-Penescum and Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler. Fiddler says the day makes him think of his late sister, Sarah Jane.
She attended residential school when she was small, and she's one of those students that just never really came home, and I've only met her twice in my life, and died in BC. That's where she's buried. So I think about her and others that never made it home. Orange Shirt Day is important, but I think the work needs to continue all year round, including in our school boards, including all service organizations. That we do need to fight, the deniers out there.
Meanwhile, the second annual Reconciliation Run took place at Boulevard Lake. The run brought out hundreds to honor the survivors of residential schools and the children who never returned home. Jessica Clement reports.
Runners and community members were up bright and early Saturday morning for the second annual Honoring Our Children Run.
Go! Thank you to our runners. We'll see you in 15 kilometers.
The event, put on by Delico in collaboration with the Mazenajum Children's Foundation, had participants running or walking 5, 10, or 15-kilometer routes in honor of the children who never returned home from residential schools, as well as survivors, their families, and their communities. The run brought out over 300 people from all over Ontario, including Jennifer Fiddler and her group, who came in from Bearskin Lake First Nation.
Our group is sponsored by the Choose Life program. These youth have been training all summer back home. We just want to teach them to be proud of who they are and to strive for their best.
Anika Guthrie, Vice President of the Mazenajum Children's Foundation Board, says the run, like other events in the city, help Canadians understand and reflect on Indigenous history in Canada.
It's a day where we pause and reflect and recognize and acknowledge that this is Canadian truth and history and the impacts that that's had on Indigenous nations here in Canada. And the beautiful thing about this run is how the runners and the Indigenous community here in Thunder Bay are just surrounded by the love and support of community.
Last year's run raised $50,000 for the Mazenajum Children's Foundation, and Guthrie says they're hoping to exceed that goal this year.
All of funds that we raise today go to support the Mazenajum Children's Foundation, which is a fund that helps First Nations children and youth achieve their dreams, whatever those are. At a run like this, where we're honoring and thinking about the children who never made it home, it's a tangible way to give back to what those survivors endured by providing and supporting Indigenous children today in our community.
Guthrie is hopeful that the run will be able to return year after year. Jessica Clement, TBT News.
Of course, Day for Truth and Reconciliation saw gatherings countrywide, though new polls suggest some Canadians are not taking part in commemorations or celebrations. This comes as Indigenous leaders are looking for reconciliation to move to the next step. CTV's Kristen Ajikute reports.
On this day of national mourning, of truth-telling and healing.
Hundreds gathered on Parliament Hill today to remember the Indigenous children who never made it home from residential school. The names of 2,800 children listed here, but survivors have long said that number is much larger.
I also want to honor the survivors for your resilience.
More than 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families, forced to attend church and government-run institutions since 1831. The last school closed in 1996, with many experiencing multiple kinds of abuse that is still felt to this day.
I would encourage us to double our efforts in advancing reconciliation. How? Where there's hatred, let us sow love.
A new poll has found that nearly half of Canadians are not planning to mark Truth and Reconciliation Day. As more learn about Canada's painful past, experts say there will be times of discomfort.
But that alone is not a good reason not to learn. And in fact, we owe it to this country, we owe it to our Indigenous neighbours to learn more, to ensure that we don't ever do this again.
In Toronto, elders held a sunrise ceremony for survivors. Leaders here say governments need to show a stronger commitment to reconciliation.
We don't talk about the theft of land and how land is going to be returned. We don't talk about how Canada all of a sudden gained all the jurisdiction in the country. We don't talk about those things, but that's the truth. Hey guys.
In Saskatchewan, the Prime Minister took part in an awareness walk in Lac La Ronge before meeting with Indigenous leaders in Saskatoon.
It was important for me that I come out with my son Hadrian because I wanted him to understand.
After nearly 6 years since it was first promised, Newfoundland and Labrador's Premier apologized for residential schools. Survivors hope it will be a turning point for reconciliation there.
And for our final story, we're going to shift things back to Thunder Bay, where an electric vehicle show was held at the CLE Coliseum to give the public a chance to learn a little more about EVs. Many in attendance were hoping the event can showcase the benefits of electric vehicles and inspire others to purchase their own. Mitchell Ringos reports.
The third annual event presented by Synergy North was in partnership with the Electrical Vehicle Association of Northern Ontario, showcasing electric vehicles and e-bikes that are shaping the future of transportation. Over 20 electric vehicles of all shapes and sizes were on hand with their owners. As co-organizer Mike Siska says, this event is meant to help people get their questions answered and to potentially get them to adopt EV ownership.
This is an opportunity to hear from many different owners, and it gives us information. We also learn. People give us, I've learned some things today that I didn't know. So, you know, it's not there 100% yet, and I could see where people are nervous about the transition, but it improves every year, and it's incredible how fast it's improved.
Also improving is the event itself, which was initially outside at Lakehead University's parking lot, but now for another year is inside, taking up the CLE Coliseum building, which Siska says has been a great change.
I think being inside, it does give it a sense of a car show, and it just shows that just like how our event has grown, things have changed. 2 years ago, I wouldn't have considered an electric car, but the infrastructure is improving every year.
With improvements does come price, as one of the hurdles for buying into electric is the initial cost. But Siska says every year that passes, it gets easier to be an EV owner.
They will come down in price, and the infrastructure will only get better. But I've had no trouble traveling distance. I've probably done 30,000 kilometers in the last 5 months, and my longest charge was 42 minutes because I chose to have a meal. Most were 15 to 20 minutes.
Along with the electric vehicle show, the event also featured a family bike swap hosted by community spokes, where residents could bring in their bikes for a quick tune-up, diagnostic session, DIY repair support, or to trade it in. Mitchell Ringos, TBT News.
And we're now joined by sports anchor Joe Sadowski. Joe, me and you were glued to the TV screen down there for the last few hours because the Blue Jays, they were at least had a chance of clinching an AL wildcard spot.
I don't want to give anything away if they didn't catch the game, but I'm sure you saw the headlines. It was not the outcome we would have hoped.
Certainly
but, you
not.
know, if the Blue Jays win, they're in. We'll have that story and more coming up after the break.